Meanwhile, somewhere in the Triverse on the other side of the portal, the Mirrorverse, we delve into Part 4 of the Commander Atlas Vale saga. Vale stood before the core, its pulsating energy illuminating the chamber with an eerie glow. The room, vast and echoing, seemed to hum with a life of its own, as if the core recognized the presence of an intruder. Vale, amidst the disarray of failing systems that otherwise thrived on order, felt like a stark contrast. He placed his makeshift coolant weapon aside, now temporarily redundant, and moved toward the core's control panel. Confronted with an intricate network of dials, switches, and screens, Vale was reminded of the incredible extent of human ingenuity and ambition that had birthed such technology. His hand paused above the controls, the weight of his impending decision heavy in the air. Manipulating the core to trigger a destructive pulse was no small feat. It required delving into the operational heart of the station, rewriting its protocols, and bypassing every built-in safety measure. As Vale manipulated the controls, the weight of his situation bore down on him. Here he was, in the heart of the station, attempting to salvage what little remained and perhaps even save himself. Yet the risk was immense, his strategy as likely to claim his life as to succeed. "If you could see me now," he whispered, a wistful smile crossing his face as he thought of Mercer, his former second-in-command. Mercer's pragmatic voice echoed in his memory, critical yet inevitably supportive, likely scoffing at the plan's audacity before standing ready to assist. The usual quiet of the core chamber was abruptly shattered by the station's intercom sputtering to life. Vale's body tensed, his mind bracing for the haunting echoes of the infected that had overrun the station. But it wasn't their inhuman cries that filled the air. Instead, a calm, distinctly human voice cut through the tension. "Do you really think you can stop it?" taunted the voice, its origin unclear. Vale pushed aside the unsettling voice from the intercom, his resolve hardening as he turned his full attention back to the core's control panel. He had successfully accessed the primary control matrix, his experienced fingers rapidly entering commands to reroute the station's energy flow. The station's AI, which had been inactive since the catastrophic outbreak, suddenly flickered to life on the display, visibly struggling to make sense of Vale's instructions. "Warning. Energy reroute might result in possible critical overload," the AI announced in its emotionless tone, its warning a clear indication of the imminent danger. "Thanks for the heads up," Vale responded dryly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a wry smile as he overrode the AI's final safety protocols. The core began to emit a high-pitched whine, signaling the building energy. The sound escalated, piercing the air as the core readied to release a potentially catastrophic pulse. Vale's plan was daring in its simplicity. Channel the core's energy into a pulse that would sweep through the station, targeting the virus-infected cells with a precise frequency he had unearthed in the abandoned research annex. It was a desperate measure, based more on hope than certainty, yet the old logs hinted it might just disrupt the virus's cellular structure and destroy it. He had set everything in motion and now stepped back from the console, his eyes fixed intently on the core. Inside, the energy swirled tumultuously, a vortex of raw power poised on the brink of action. The AI's voice commenced the countdown, each second ticking closer to the critical moment. Vale's body tensed as he prepared for whatever came next. Success would mean the end of the horrific ordeal that had overrun the station and its predecessor, the Requiem. Failure was an unthinkable abyss. As the final seconds ticked down, Vale held his breath, hoping against hope that his audacious gamble would end the nightmare. The chamber shook as the pulse surged through it, unleashing a torrent of blinding light. Vale instinctively shielded his eyes, the overwhelming roar of the core's release muffling every other sound. Then, as abruptly as it had erupted, the chaos ceased. The light receded and the roar dwindled into an eerie hush. In the aftermath, time seemed to stand still. The core's light stabilized, bathing the chamber in a calm, eerie glow. Vale stood transfixed, his breath caught in the suspense of the moment, his eyes scanning for any hint of success or the grim sign of his failure. The silence that followed was profound, almost tangible, pressing down on him with the weight of the unknown. The chamber, now only softly illuminated by the core's subdued glow, appeared to be holding its breath, awaiting the outcome of Vale's audacious risk. Motionless, He stood alone amidst the vast, quiet expanse of technology that he had turned into a desperate last resort. The brief silence in the chamber was abruptly broken by a low, guttural moaning that permeated the air, a chilling sound that signaled the approach of the infected. Vale's heart dropped as he quickly realized the pulse had not provided the clean resolution he had desperately hoped for. Rather than eradicating the virus, it seemed to have stirred the infected into an even more frenzied state. They surged towards him like a tidal wave, their twisted limbs and snarling faces a grotesque reminder of the humanity they had once possessed, now cruelly stripped away by the virus. Instinctively, Vale sprung into action, driven by the raw survival instincts that had sustained him through the crisis. He grabbed his makeshift coolant weapon, its tank nearly empty but still capable of firing. The confined space of the chamber became both a blessing and a curse, funneling the horde towards him through a narrow choke point, yet severely limiting his own movements. With determination, Vale prepared to defend himself, knowing he had little ground to retreat and no choice but to confront the onslaught head-on. Vale unleashed the coolant in short-controlled bursts, the hissing of the liquid nitrogen as it met the air nearly drowned out by the enraged howls of the infected. The initial wave halted abruptly, their bodies freezing mid-assault, turning their flesh hard and brittle. Vale didn't pause to assess the effect. He swiftly moved, using the brief calm to find a position with better defensibility. Behind him, the frozen forms of the first wave of infected shattered under the relentless advance of their comrades, who seemed undeterred by the grim fate of those ahead. Vale understood the grim reality. He couldn't hold them off forever. The coolant was only a temporary stopgap, and he was also running low on ammunition. In a desperate attempt to control the situation, Vale aimed at the overhead conduits. With precise shots, he ruptured them, sending sparks and electrical arcs raining down on the advancing infected. Some fell, twitching violently as the high voltage coursed through them, yet the tide of attackers continued. Vale's situation was dire, but he was determined to use every available resource to fend off the relentless onslaught. The chamber transformed into a gruesome battleground, the air thick with the stench of burned flesh and the sharp tang of ozone. Vale fought with a ferocity born of sheer desperation, each movement strategically planned to maximize the dwindling supplies at his disposal. He was more than a survivor now. He was the last bastion of defense against a relentless tide that threatened to overrun him completely. As he used up the last reserves of his coolant, Vale was forced into hand-to-hand combat. He wielded the butt of his weapon with grim determination, using it to fend off the infected as they surged towards him. They came in waves, an endless stream of mutated forms driven by a primal urge to consume and destroy. Amidst the chaos, Vale sustained injuries, gashes and bites that marred his flesh, each wound a painful reminder of the infected's relentless aggression. Despite the pain, his resolve only hardened, bordering on the fanatical. Surrender was not an option for Vale. He fought on, driven by a deep-seated determination to hold his ground, to not be overwhelmed by the nightmare that had besieged the station. The battle continued relentlessly, a brutal symphony of violence fueled by raw survival instincts. Finally, the relentless onslaught began to ebb, the numbers of the infected slowly but noticeably dwindled. Exhausted, Vale stood amid the devastation, breathing heavily. His body was a living canvas of wounds and bruises, each mark a story of narrow escapes and desperate fights. The chamber around him bore the scars of conflict, the floor slick with remnants of the struggle, littered with the debris of what had once been a technological sanctuary. For a fleeting moment, a deceptive calm filled the space. Yet Vale was under no illusion that this quiet signaled the end. The virus remained a pervasive threat, lurking in the hidden corners of the station, ever ready to reclaim its dominance. As the sole survivor in this necropolis of steel and shadows, he knew all too well that the war he was waging was far from over. This was merely a brief respite in an ongoing battle against an unseen and relentless enemy. Vale was entrenched in a war of attrition, one he was resolute to endure to its bitter end, regardless of the sacrifice required. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, Vale's breaths were heavy and ragged. The core chamber, once a symbol of technological prowess, now looked more like a scene from some grotesque nightmare. It was illuminated by the flickering lights of damaged consoles and the subdued, almost taunting pulse of the core itself. While his physical injuries were extensive, it was the psychological scars that weighed most heavily on him. Vale had endured unimaginable horrors and fought battles that seemed as if they were conjured from the darkest nightmares. Amidst the newfound silence, the haunting voice that had once taunted him over the intercom continued to reverberate, its menacing words echoing in the stillness, a chilling reminder of the psychological warfare that accompanied the physical struggles he faced. "Do you really think you can stop it? Stop me?" Then with a booming voice it revealed its name once again, Zelos. And there it was, the very name the virus had uttered on the Requiem. This simply couldn't be a coincidence. The taunting question, intended to instill doubt, instead sparked a defiant fire within Vale. After all he had endured and all he had lost, he refused to let the specter of failure dominate his thoughts. With grim resolve, he began to fortify the core chamber, ingeniously using whatever remnants of the station's maintenance supplies he could find to seal the breaches through which the infected had swarmed. As Vale worked, the station's communication system crackled back to life, jolting him into alertness. He braced himself for another round of psychological attacks. However, this time, the transmission was different. It was a looped distress signal from another sector of the station. The message was broken, the voice distorted by static, but the desperate plea for help was unmistakable. Vale paused, the urgency in the fractured voice cutting through the static, a stark reminder that there were still survivors, still people who needed him. This realization rekindled his resolve, pushing him to press on, not just for his own survival, but for theirs as well. "Is anyone, please, need help?" The plaintive call, faint and fractured, settled over Vale with a weight that made his next steps feel inevitable. Resigned yet resolute, he made the decision to respond. Despite understanding the pervasive danger of the virus and the uncertainty of finding survivors, the mere possibility of another human voice in the desolation was enough to spur him into action. He quickly gathered what he could, makeshift weapons and the last remnants of his coolant device, prepared for whatever lay ahead. The station's corridors, now a labyrinth of shadows and eerie silence, bore the scars of recent chaos. The scorch marks and strewn debris a grim tapestry of the events that had unfolded. Vale moved with deliberate caution, each step measured yet swift, his senses sharply tuned to detect any movement or the faintest hint of the infected lurking nearby. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the distant echoes of the station's structural groans, making every shadow a potential threat. Yet, Vale pressed on, driven by the hope of finding another survivor, another soul clinging to life amid the devastation. As Vale approached the origin of the distress transmission, the extent of the devastation unleashed by the virus was starkly evident. The corridor walls were disfigured by grotesque, unnatural growths, and the air was thick with a miasma that spoke of decay and deep-seated corruption. It was a scene straight from a nightmare, yet it led him to the desperate source of the plea for help. What Vale found was a tableau of dire desperation. A group of survivors huddled within a makeshift shelter, their faces hollow, eyes wide with a mix of fear and fleeting hope. They were scientists, members of the station's research team, who had narrowly escaped the viral infection. They had managed to barricade themselves away, but were now trapped, their supplies dwindling, and their hope dimming with each passing moment. The arrival of Vale was met with a mixture of relief and wariness. The survivors cautiously eyed the weapons he carried, the tangible reminders of the outside dangers, even as they recognized him as their chance for rescue. Among them was the voice that had called out over the intercom, a researcher who had managed to uncover the grim truth about the virus's origins. This person, now visibly relieved yet exhausted, represented a key to understanding the virus, potentially offering Vale not just the chance to save these survivors, but to perhaps end the nightmare that had consumed the station. "It's not just a pathogen. It's more than that," the researcher explained, her voice tinged with a weariness that betrayed countless sleepless nights spent analyzing relentless streams of data. "It's a precursor to something far greater, far more malevolent. I think the mechanoids are back." Vale felt a shiver run down his spine as this revelation added a new layer of terror to the nightmare he had been enduring. The virus was not merely a disease. It was the vanguard of something much more powerful, a harbinger for an entity that sought to consume not just the station, but potentially all existence in the universe. The researcher elaborated on her findings, speaking of ancient wars and cosmic horrors, robots on the outside, flesh and biomatter on the inside. Centuries ago, they were the cosmic horrors that lurked in the spaces between stars, beings with insatiable appetites, devouring entire star systems. As Vale absorbed her words, the horrific events aboard the Requiem and the station started to make sense, forming a narrative that stretched beyond known science into the realm of cosmic horror. Despite the staggering nature of this story, the evidence before him made the threat undeniably real and the urgency of their situation crystal clear. Vale muttered under his breath, "They've been extinct for centuries. If these really are the mechanoids, then we're dealing with something completely unfamiliar, something new and far more sinister." The Requiem, all Entex ships in space, were ordered to seek out any leftover hive minds. Other than some remnants, nothing more has ever been found. In the dim light of the researchers' revelations, Vale's initial plan, which had started with manipulating the core, drastically evolved. It was no longer just about the immediate survival of those huddled in the makeshift shelter, but about averting a potential apocalypse. With the path ahead crystal clear, yet brimming with peril, Vale understood the magnitude of what needed to be done. Armed with the collective knowledge of the survivors and the remnants of the station's resources, Vale began to devise a new strategy. This plan would demand every ounce of his cunning and courage. The battle against the immediate threat might have been daunting, but the war against this deeper, darker force was just beginning. The entity they were up against was no mere hazard to their isolated outpost. It threatened the very fabric of reality itself. Despite their physical and mental exhaustion, the survivors rallied behind Vale, fortified by a shared resolve. Their deep knowledge of the station's systems and the intricacies of the virus now proved to be invaluable. Together they began to lay the groundwork for the daunting battle ahead, each aware of the stakes involved in their fight against a darkness that extended beyond the confines of their reality. The plan was as audacious as it was desperate: to transform the station itself into a weapon against the encroaching cosmic might. The core, which Vale had already manipulated to release a pulse against the virus, would serve as the linchpin in this final stand. However, before they could initiate their full strategy, they needed to secure additional sections of the station, areas that had been lost to the infected. Armed with improvised weapons and whatever was left of the station's defense systems, Vale and the group of survivors ventured out from the relative safety of their makeshift sanctuary. They moved cautiously, aware that each corridor and chamber could become a fierce battleground. As they advanced, their movements attracted the attention of the infected, who responded with relentless assaults. Wave after wave of the mutated beings came at them, their numbers hardly seeming to dwindle despite the heavy toll Vale's earlier defenses had exacted. This push to reclaim parts of the station was not just a tactical necessity, it was a fight for survival against both the infected horde and the looming greater threat that sought to unravel the very fabric of reality. Vale led the charge, his unyielding determination now channeled into formidable combat prowess. The survivors, inspired by his leadership, discovered reservoirs of strength they hadn't known they possessed. Together they forged ahead, cutting through the hordes of infected, reclaiming vital systems, and strengthening their hold within the station. In the thick of battle, amidst the chaos and carnage, moments of humanity flickered like sparks in the dark. A joke passed between breaths to lighten the heart, a hand extended to pull a comrade to safety amidst a skirmish. These fleeting instances were reminders of their underlying fight, not merely for survival, but for the essence of their humanity. As the group drew closer to the core, the menacing entity known as Zelos made its ominous presence felt. The very air around them seemed to thicken and distort, a tangible dread filling the atmosphere and pressing down on their spirits. Yet the survivors' faces were etched with resolve, a silent acknowledgement shared among them of the gravity of their situation. This was far beyond a mere struggle for survival. It was a pivotal stand against an encroaching apocalypse that threatened everything they held dear. The core chamber transformed into their fortress, the epicenter of their last stand. Vale, drawing upon every fragment of knowledge and resource known about their enemy and anything new they had collected, readied himself for the impending assault. Each survivor knew their part, their collective resolve forming an unbreakable bond as they prepared to face whatever came next. Then, With a roar that reverberated through the entire structure, the entity made its presence known. Its arrival was marked by a terrifying cacophony, the station itself seeming to tremble in fear. The entity was a horrifying amalgamation of flesh and machine, its form a nightmare given shape. The ensuing battle was monumental, a titanic struggle not just of physical might, but of willpower. Vale stood at the vanguard, a symbol of defiance and hope, his leadership inspiring the survivors to summon a level of ferocity that surpassed their physical limits. Together, they tapped into the core's energy, converting it into brilliant beams of light and intense heat that sliced through the encroaching darkness, a literal and figurative fight between light and darkness. Despite its immense power, the entity found itself unexpectedly challenged by Vale and his determined band of survivors. Their defiant stand shook the very foundations of the station, each pulse of energy and clash of wills causing the structure to tremble, as the outcome of their epic confrontation hung precariously in the balance. Summoning all their remaining strength for one last concerted effort, Vale and the survivors converged their focus onto Zelos. Together, they channeled every ounce of available energy into a single, monumental burst. The core responded with a spectacular explosion of light, a piercing lance of sheer defiance that sliced through the oppressive darkness, directly targeting the mechanoid itself. This burst of radiant energy was not just a weapon but a statement, a bold declaration of their unwillingness to succumb or fade into the shadows. As the core discharged its massive burst of energy, the station quivered as though in its final death throes, the backlash creating a tempest that threatened to dismantle the very structure they sought to protect. Yet, amidst this overwhelming chaos, there emerged a moment of sharp, undeniable clarity, a profound sense of victory against all conceivable odds. The oppressive darkness began to retreat, the menacing presence of the entity receding, its form diminishing, until nothing remained but the station itself. The structure was battered and scarred from the ordeal. Exhausted yet triumphant, the survivors allowed themselves a brief interlude of cautious relief. They had stood their ground, repelling the darkness with nothing but their collective resolve and the blazing light of their courage. However, Vale, ever the realist, understood the complexity of their victory. They had not destroyed it. They had merely forced it back, delaying its terrifying advance. The cost of this temporary peace had been enormous, and while they had earned a moment of reprieve, Vale knew that the struggle against such profound darkness was far from finished. The future remained uncertain, and the specter of the mechanoid's return loomed large. As they regrouped in the core chamber, the survivors' eyes turned toward the vastness of space visible beyond the station's battered hull. Standing there, Vale understood that their struggle was merely one chapter in a much larger saga. The mechanoid, along with others of its kind, still lurked in the universe. Humanity had to be ready for them once again. For the moment, however, they had secured a precious respite, a chance to catch their breath, to heal from their wounds, and to prepare for the inevitable battles yet to come. Surrounded by the weary but resolute faces of the survivors, Vale felt the full weight of his role. The responsibility of leadership, heavy and demanding, settled firmly upon his shoulders. He had guided them through an unimaginable darkness, and he was prepared to lead them through whatever challenges the future held, their collective gaze fixed on the stars that watched silently from the void. And with that, we bid farewell to Commander Atlas Vale, at least for now. I am confident that wherever he is needed in the future, he will be there on the front lines, ready to confront whatever threat humanity may face. If you've stuck with me up to this point, a heartfelt thank you. I'd also like to take a moment to remind you that my entire channel is dedicated to the Triverse and its enthralling mechanoid saga. While many of the stories stand alone, allowing you to dive in at any point, crafting these narratives takes about 4 or 5 days each, so your patience is greatly appreciated. If you find yourself enjoying what you see, consider exploring more of my videos. Each one, in its own unique way, weaves together more of the overarching story I'm telling.